Okay, a quick response to pyrrho314, why you need consciousness. Yeah, I'm quite happy to use the word consciousness, you're absolutely right. I'm just thinking it's used in different ways for different purposes. And the way it's used is slippery, and it's often used strategically. Sometimes by yourself, Pyrrho, to cover gaps in your argument, but more by people like Deepak Chopra, who was at it before, he uses it as a kind of universal solution for everything he wants to talk about. Now I'm using it I'm using it, but I'm critiquing it in two ways, or I'm using it in two ways and critiquing the misapplication of it. And I guess this also relates to Matt's recent video, which I haven't processed fully in my mind yet, but I will at some point, where he's talking about it as well. But firstly, as a kind of aspect of phenomenology, I'd absolutely be fine to use it. And as I said in a previous video, I would regard consciousness as a radial category marked by prototypes and family resemblances. And for those entities which are in the middle of a radial category, there's no doubt that these things are absolutely typical forms. You know, as I said, I firmly believe that you have consciousness. I know that I have from the inside, and I'm the most prototypical example of my own definition of consciousness. I suspect my dog has, I'm slightly less sure, and I don't know about lots of other animals, but I'm sure that plants and bacteria and machines don't have that quality that I'm talking about. So in that level I can use consciousness. Certainly I can use it with a degree of stability to describe those entities which are roughly at the centre of my prototypical, have some kind of prototypical, beg your pardon, which demonstrate prototypicality and are therefore at the centre of that radial category. I have no problem with that. It's when you start talking about plants having consciousness or some other term that relates to consciousness, that's when it becomes problematic, and it should become problematic for you, quite frankly, because prototypical, those categories which are marked like that do have very fuzzy boundaries, and that's where all the interesting stuff happens for sure, but it's also where definitions become really, really difficult. Yeah, so that's one aspect of it. So I'm happy to use the word consciousness, but only to refer to examples which lie well away from the edge of that category, because there isn't really an edge, it's a fuzzy boundary. The other way I talk about it, and this is a kind of internal critique, is, for example, in the video that I made about comparing consciousness to the motricity or the motility of a car, and talking about people's tendency to essentialize consciousness, and talk about it as if this car had, rather than break the car down to its moving components, you would just say, but it's got this special quality of motricity about it. Yeah, I think people do that, and I think you do that sometimes, to be frank, Pyrrho. And that's what happens when you refuse to acknowledge that it's a variable category with different components, which is the other thing about it. If you deal with it phenomenologically in the first way I've talked about, then yes, you can treat consciousness as a single entity, just like you can treat motion as a single entity. You can talk about motion, you can make physical laws of motion, you can compare the motion of one car to the motion of another, it's no problem at all. But when you go into the detail, then you have to to find out how a car works and to find out how consciousness works, then you have to go into the details. So that's the way I'm using it differently. If you're talking about consciousness as a phenomenological entity, I would say you have to work with those organisms that you are absolutely sure have the consciousness that that fit the description that you're having. And right now, the only ones that really, really do fit that are you and I and the rest of humans. But I would extend that out into the animal kingdom a bit. But yes, talking about the way that these things interrelate is one thing. But going into the details and saying what is consciousness, then you're dealing with fringe, border, or beyond the fringe entities. And that's where you need to be specific about the components of consciousness. Otherwise you are bringing in essentialism through the back door. Not all entities have consciousness. My dog doesn't have consciousness in the same way that I have consciousness. I don't have consciousness now in the same way that I had an hour ago when I was asleep, and so on. And it's those distinctions which mark out the interesting territory. In fact, I don't think I have distinct consciousness now because I've got my eyes shut in quite the same way that I have now when I've got my eyes open. So yeah, I would absolutely vote for going in there and looking at and taking the engine apart and looking at the details of it, or at least talking about the interesting components of the engine. But yeah, that's it really. You have a tendency to psychoanalyze. Do you know that, Pyrrho? In your last video, or maybe there was the comment, you have a tendency to attribute psychological motivations to my videos. Do you know that? It's interesting. I think in this one you referred to me as running away from the argument, and in a previous set of comments you talked about I don't know, some kind of psychological motivation why I might hold certain opinions and I might be expressing certain views. Might be worth considering your own.